defensive line as well. I think getting we talked about how the interior is where it's at. They've got decisions to make on John and Duran. We can talk about that at a different day. We're kind of just talking about what they need to bring in. I do think getting a really high level edge player would be really enormous for this team. I don't know that there's one necessarily out there that they're going to be able to snag. But man, if they could figure that out, trade, whatever, like that is a position where if you just have a guy who you can rely upon to get pressure in the big situations, that is such a game changer for a defense. I think you see it around the league. Whether it's guys like Chris Jones on the inside, whether it's someone like TJ Watt on the outside, in the big moments, because think of how many big downs did not go Washington's way defensively this year, where you get to 3rd and 10 and you're just like, all right, here we go. And you're like, okay, here comes the flag on Marshawn or BSJ or the completion on Noah or whatever, because these guys, they blitz, gets hung out to dry. And I think the other, like one of the ways they were trying to do that was with Frankie. And I think Frankie had a sensational season. But I think the weakest part of his season was probably when he actually lined up as an edge player. Like a lot of his pressures and blitzes came as an off-ball linebacker where he's just one of the best. So can you find that third down edge player that more consistently can win and in the biggest spots can be trusted upon to win? That to me is high on my list as well.
Yeah, and I think that is probably, and this is something that I just want to get out there. Like, when you're a GM, I think you're always just trying to get more talent on the team. And so all of these comments and, criticisms of the team, they're not necessarily criticisms of the guys here. They did a great job in the roles that they had, but you're always trying to get better. And I think like that's ultimately what we're talking about is can you get people who are more physically dominant? Like there's a reason that, like everyone wants to move on from Logan Paulson over the course of his career, right? It's like, was Logan Paulson a good pro in his role? Yeah. But like, can you get better? Absolutely. And so that's more what we're talking about in the context of this. And I will say like for this year's draft class, like this is a great year for just freaky, big, long defensive end, defensive tackle type prospects here. So like this is one of those things where you're talking about roster construction. You're picking at 28? I forget, 29. Yeah, you're picking at 29, and you'll have an opportunity there to draft maybe Samar Stewart. If he's 6'6", he's 280, he's super raw, but he's a physical freak, right? Or Ivy from Ole Miss, and like there's just a ton of defense. Like when you talk about value in the draft, there's just these guys that are very valuable because at edge, there's a lot of value there. So I think you could find people that kind of fit what you're looking for defensively. And again, just get a little bit more talented. That doesn't mean you don't want to bring Deontay Fowler back because of what he did, but maybe you can get a person that helps him have more of a pass rush specialist role and he's not playing as much as he was on first and second down and let him really lean into his superpower, So I think that's something I would totally agree with. And again, like that's, when you think about the good teams in the league, defensive line, very good. Offensive line, very good. And there's a reason for that. Because it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the defense. And I love the distinction you pointed out there, or the observation you had there, when you're like, if the defensive line's playing a little bit better, it insulates the coverage group a little bit better. Joe Wood Jr. doesn't have to blitz as much, right? We can play more conservative structures. Like that's one of the geniuses of Vic Fangio. Like everywhere he's been, like when I was in Chicago with him, the defensive front there were a bunch of absolute freaks, right? He could play a softer zone coverage behind because the front was so good. You see it in Philly, right? And you see where he struggles. He doesn't have those freaks in the front. So again, like this just makes it easier for everyone to do it. Now you got to go find that guy. You got to develop that guy. All those things have to happen. But it's one of those things that, you've definitely circled that area in a red pen and be like, how do we just get a little bit more dynamic on the offensive and defensive lines?
Then there's the back end part of it. They were very clear that Marshawn Lattimore's coming back, which is not surprising. Just there was, I think, more questions, obviously, of how the season ended. And I think there's some stuff there. I thought Kime was great on his podcast talking about how, Marshawn, the competitiveness you love, but there's an accountability that he needs to probably take that is a better fit with this locker room and the way Dan goes about his business. Like Nikki asked him about the fight with AJ Brown after the game, and he just like didn't want to talk about it. And that's not really how this team is rolled.
Sure.
And so there's an accountability piece, but he'll go through the entire offseason. He'll get that. He'll be here from day one. So that's going to be part of it. I think they would love probably to move Sanders still back inside. And then you got to figure out the other corner. There are definitely some guys in free agency. We can talk about the draft. We can talk about that stuff in a second, but that's definitely an area I think you address. Obviously, you're going to have to figure out safety opposite of Quan. That very well might be bringing Jeremy Chin back. I would be all about that. He was great. And then you got to figure out same thing with linebacker. You have Jordan McGee you drafted last year. And that's something that, as we go, we'll probably do like a rookie report podcast, maybe even next week. And some of the improvements, some of these positions that we're going to talk about, like part of the thing they need to happen is guys that were drafted last year need to step up and assume bigger roles. And like, duh, that's how drafting works. Yeah. Draft and develop. It's not that you are what you are day one and you come in and we know everything. But like obviously Mikey, if he can lock down that inside slot spot and then you sign someone else outside, well, there's your quarter position. You're set. If you want to bring back Bobby, I'm all for that as well, considering what he meant to this team, not only defensively, but what he meant to Jaden. Then you're starting a succession plan there. Is Jordan McGee that guy, or do you go find someone else as well? So like those are the things I think defensively. Offensively, receiver is really fascinating because you have some of both. You have a guy in Luke McCaffrey who, as a third-round pick, needs to have a bigger role next year if that pick is going to wind up being deemed successful. There's no question about that. And then you have guys like De'Ami Brown and OZ and these one-year guys that you probably, some of them you want to bring back, but you certainly also want to get a better number 2 to go opposite Terry. You now know Terry's a bona fide number 1. Yeah. Any question about that? Over. Then I like a guy like De'Ami as my next, not my number 2, but like the next guy to say, I know I can rely upon him to be a useful player in rotation. And if one of my top 2 guys goes down, I know I'm not dead in the water based off what he did in these playoffs and how he's developed. But I do think that you want to go fishing in some deeper waters there and some more expensive waters, if you will, to find a number 2, whether that is in the draft or going free agency. And it doesn't have to necessarily be T. Higgins, but there's some other guys as well.
Yeah, and it probably won't be in the draft this year because, again, there's, when you go through your draft eval, like this is probably the weakest receiver draft that I've done in a while. Like last year it was incredibly deep. There was guys that you thought, could play and contribute, and you get a guy drafted in the 5th round like Johnny Wilson who's playing significant minutes for the Philadelphia Eagles, right? Like you just get these role players throughout the NFL that are just, again, because the draft was so incredibly deep. This year is not really that way, And so what I would say is one thing that I would kind of think about here if you're a fan of the Commanders and you're a fan of football is, yes, you could go and say we need to get another dynamic receiver, but also this year's tight end class is silly in terms of pass-catching tight ends, right? And this is not an indictment of Ben Sinnott. This is not an indictment of Zach Ertz. But I think in the same way with Bobby Wagner, you need to think of a succession plan. Like Ben Sinnott, I think, is going to be a good football player. But is he ever going to be what Zach Ertz is right now? I don't know, man. Like, what's that Zach was – and I think fans maybe sleep on how effective Zach was this year in terms of man-to-man situations and winning consistently on third down. And think of him in the same category as like prime Jordan Reed, like just that guy that's like, this is a one-on-one, I can trust you to win. And so like is there a person in this draft that is, maybe that's your number 2 player? Does that make sense what I'm saying? Like kind of the same way Kansas City's constructed where it's like Travis Kelce's your number 1. And so obviously Terry's the number 1 here, but your number 2 receiver's actually this kind of move piece tight end. And again, like I don't know if Adam would kind of go that direction, but that's something just because
that's kind of what he had in San Francisco, right? Yeah. It's like the number 1, Ayuk, I guess, but like also the number 1's kind of Kittle.
Yeah. And so finding a guy like that in terms of mismatches, and that's why the tight end position is so valuable, is because you're going to draw a good matchup. Like that's in a sport and where it's all matchup based on third down, right? Terry's going to draw the number 1 corner because that's what Terry is. But you're not going to put your number 1 corner, I hope not, on the tight end usually, right? So he's going to draw a safety or a linebacker, and that's where those guys can be so incredibly successful. So in this year's draft, there's a bunch of guys that catch the football really well. Terrence Ferguson from Oregon, Arroyo from Miami is another guy that catches the ball really well. That'll kind of be there that late first round, maybe late second.
There's like two or three guys in a lot of mock drafts going in the top 20.
Yeah, and so like Warren from Penn State's a beast. Loveland from Michigan is a beast.
Yeah.
And I think those guys will be long gone by the time the Commanders are picking, which is a good problem to have. You're winning football games, but there are other guys later in this draft class. Harold Fannin from Bowling Green, very unique in terms of body type and movement skills, but caught 117 balls last year, in college. So there are guys that you say, maybe it's not receiver because it's kind of a weak receiver class, but maybe it's one of these tight ends. And that's where I think with the receiver thing, if you really say we need a true number 2, like if you're a Commanders fan, make sure you're checking out that free agency list hard and saying not who the best player is, but maybe who the best fit is for what Cliff Kingsbury wants to do.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, and by the way, receivers, you got T. Higgins, who's going to probably reset the market, period, because he's going to be a true free agent and be out there to get paid. I mean, Chris Godwin, I doubt he gets out of Tampa, but oh my God, am I interested in Chris Godwin?
Dude, I know he's coming off the injury, but that's the one, every time I look at the list, I'm like, he would be perfect.
He would be incredible.
If he's healthy.
Amari Cooper's older, but he's on the list. There's quite a number of guys, obviously. I'm not really interested in Stephon Diggs, but he's available. But there are some guys out there. Darius Slayton, I think, is a really interesting sleeper from New York because he's got real speed. And that's something that I think showed with Diami this year, the power of true team speed in this offense. So that's something to watch as well. And obviously, as we said, the thing that kind of needs to happen, no matter what, no matter how you attack the acquisitions, is Luke needs to take a step next year.
Yeah.
And
Ben needs to take a step. They all need to take a step forward. Yeah.
For sure. And that's just, again, that's not a shot at what those guys did as rookies or saying that they're busts or anything. And it drives me nuts when people try to say that. And I'm like, no. They're young players. It's hard to play as a rookie in the NFL. But if they develop over time, those can be really good picks still. And next year, obviously, they need to take that first big leap and get a lot more minutes, a lot more snaps. The other thing on offense, as we kind of tuck tight end in there, is the running back position.
Yeah.
And obviously Eckler was pretty sensational. B-Rob had some really nice moments this year, but I'm very curious to see how they attack this position because I think we see obviously the impact that a really, really great running back can have. And there just aren't a lot of them that are worth that, right? This isn't some rebirth of the running back position. It's just, I think, a recalibration of the market of if Saquon's worth paying, Derrick Henry's worth paying, the Christian McCaffrey's worth paying because those guys can be the engines of an offense. And obviously Ashton Genty's in the draft, although I saw Bucky Brooks had him going 12th to Dallas. He's probably long gone by the time Washington gets on the board. But I think that how they attack that position is super interesting to me. I don't know what the right move is. I haven't gotten deep enough in the class either way yet, but it is something to watch of do they try to attack that position to try to give Jaden some more help in the backfield and build a more potent and explosive running game in 2025.
Yeah, and again, like we just talked about with Saquon, while the runner is important, the offensive line is equally as important there. So that's where it's you get good offensive line talent, you improve the offensive line, whether it's through scheme or personnel, and you get an elevation not only of the quarterback, but also of the runner. And if I was going to put money on something this offseason, I would put a lot of money that they're going to draft a running back. It's not going to probably be in the first 2 rounds. It's probably going to be in the 3rd round. And this isn't a knock on B-Rob or Austin Eckler. This is more of a testament to just how damn good this running back class is. It's silly. There's kind of like the receiver class last year where you're like, this dude's really good. You're just watching backs. You're like, this dude's really good. This dude's big and he's strong and he's breaking tackles. This guy's good in protection. This guy can catch the football. This guy's got
And we see it all the time with rookie running backs. Think of Bucky Irving this year, 3rd round pick. And everyone knew he was good.
Yeah.
And it's oh yeah, but he's a running back. So he gets drafted in the 3rd round and then he's a 1,000-yard rusher and changes the Bucs' whole season.
Yeah, and so I would say there's a couple guys that are really good. Ashton Genty, the kid from North Carolina, I think his last name is Hampton. Those guys are kind of in their own bucket, but the next guys, that next tier is really impressive in terms of you can get a big guy, you can get a small guy, you get a scat back, you can get a converted wide receiver. It's all kind of in there. So I would say if I was putting money on it, they're picking somebody, and they might pick 2 just because it's so deep. And so this is also where free agent decisions or offseason decisions, are often reflect the market. So if it's a strong free agent, wide receiver group, you're probably going to pick up a receiver from that group, right? If it's a strong in the draft, because the receiver class is so weak in the draft this year, it's free agency, right? Running back is so strong in the draft this year. You're probably going to draft a run. It's just like you're probably going to draft a defensive lineman. You might draft a tight end just because those positions are so strong this year. And are they the greatest positions of value? No, but I do think that it kind of just because the value is so good there, you're probably going to go in that direction.
For sure. And so we've kind of done, as we've gone here, the thing that we were going to do at the end, which is take a look. No, it's all right. I almost did it this way on purpose. Instead, we did it this way on accident. So it's fine. You got to roll with the punches sometimes, Logan. You got to be adaptable here in these podcasting streets. We talked about the contours of these draft classes. So just real quick to kind of put a bow on that, scrolling through ESPN, for instance, they just put out, Matt Bowen put out a top 50. Like there's a lot of DBs in this top 50. There's quite a few offensive linemen in this top 50. Obviously at the top of it is T. Higgins. So you have a couple of wide receivers that we mentioned, but you also have, I think, some interesting guys. I mean, the number 2 free agent on this list is a guy that's number 1 on a lot of boards, and it is a guy that I would consider spending money on. Trey Smith from Kansas City is a free agent. They're guard.
Really?
He's 26 years old. Like he had a heck of a season. I think like Ryan Poles, who was in Kansas City when they drafted him, like Chicago's a team to watch out for here, but like there are some good younger players that are out there at positions that are interesting. DJ Reed, corner, who's 28 from the Jets. Like, he's interesting. Obviously, Godwin, we mentioned. Khalil Mack, like, do you want to go the super veteran route and pick off a couple of those? Like, Charvarius Ward from who's 29, a corner from San Francisco, but he obviously was with Adam in San Francisco. Josh Sweat's 28, and he's going to be a free agent from Philly. I think a big one to watch, for obvious reasons, Odighizuwa from Dallas, the defensive tackle. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about a penetrating defensive tackle who knows how to thrive in Dan Quinn's system. So there's a lot of really interesting free agents. And again, the Commanders have a ton of space, and then they don't need to pay their own outside of giving Terry an extension, and their quarterback's going to be cheap as hell for the next 4 years. So I think that's really interesting to watch. I think a guy, or like, what do they do in terms of Sam Cosmi? Is he going to be ready for camp? If not, are you interested in like a Zach Martin on a 1-year deal? He's a free agent from Dallas. So I think that there's a lot of really interesting, both younger veteran options and older veteran options, guys like Martin, Mack, who could be leaders and are going to be looking to chase a ring, but could also help lay the foundation. And I think of what Jaden Daniels wrote on the jersey he signed for Bobby Wagner, Logan. I don't know if you saw this.
No.
But on locker cleanout day, Jaden signed a jersey for Bobby, and he said, "You set the standard forever."
Oh, wow.
And I think of those kinds of guys that Dan was pretty explicit in saying, like, we're going to have those guys always in our locker room. So there's a lot of options here in the free agent class. And then you can talk a little bit more about the contour of the draft class and positions that are strong, weak, et cetera.
Yeah, well, I think it's good. And I think the thing that I'm always thinking about with free agency is like top flight wide receivers really hit the market. So seeing T. Higgins on there is enticing. But again,
and Chris Godwin, by the way, is a second guy. If he even gets there, we'll see if Tampa lets him out of the building by the time free agency actually opens.
Yeah, correct. And then elite offensive linemen usually don't hit the market in free agency. So when you look at those, like, and again, like it's kind of not great, but the receiver class is very weak in this class, and the offensive line class is kind of weak in the draft this year. And there are guys with talent, and I think that's where it makes me optimistic, right? There's talented guys on the offensive line, but they're either from a small school, they're really raw, they haven't played a lot. There's a couple things they got to work on in terms of cleaning up their game. So if you're willing to maybe take a guy late in the second round and say, we're going to develop you and get you right, kind of like you did with Brandon Coleman this year, I think you might be in a decent spot. So like, just to give you that kind of contour. So some of the other things we talked about, like if I was going to say what are the best positions in this class, definitely defensive line. So if I'm Dan Quinn, I may not be looking at that defensive line list that closely. Obviously, Odighizuwa, but anytime you can get bigger, stronger, faster in that group, like this is a great year to do it in the draft. Again, with guys that maybe are a little bit raw, a little bit developmental, but have the physical traits that make you kind of jump out of your seat and say, I want you to be a Washington Commander, right? You mentioned tight ends, like that's one that I think is so interesting because the tight end group is so talented from a pass catching standpoint, but you just drafted Ben Sinnott, right? So like, do you say, hey, we're going to ride with Ben see if he develops. It just seems like such a big jump for him to be Zach Ertz in 2 years. And we've seen crazier things, but that's one where I'm like, maybe. And then running back, like we just talked about, is interesting. And then DB. I think DB is a fun one this year. There are some guys that are really talented. And so when you talk about getting a little bit more depth, maybe a starting caliber player on the perimeter, moving Mike inside, there are some guys here that I think are kind of, again, like there's a DB from Florida State. I'm still learning how to say his name. It's like Araya. It's like got like a Y and an apostrophe H at the end.
Dane Brugler. I know the beast doesn't come out for like 2 months, but can we at least get the pronunciation guide?
We got to get that one going. So, but he's a man corner from Florida State who's big, he's long, kind of fits what Dan wants to do. He led the team in tackles last year. He was second team in tackles. We'll talk about like the way the Commanders get down on the perimeter. Like he seems like an interesting guy. I don't know if he's a first round pick or early second round pick, but a guy that would make your football team significantly better. So there are pieces there. It just, again, like this is so hard to do because I think we're still getting a feel, you and I both, for like with Ron, it was very clear, like the way Ron spoke about stuff, you can kind of get a direction for what he was thinking for the offseason. Adam, to his credit, is a little bit more, I don't know if guarded's the word. He's just like, he's not going to share information.
He doesn't say anything at the podium, man. It's brutal for us, but also like I get it. And what am I going to do? Complain about it that he's doing a good job?
That you're doing what a GM's supposed to do, which is say something without saying anything. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. Like, hey, we're really excited about these opportunities, and then you're like, okay, cool, but like, what are you guys thinking about this offseason? And so we don't really know yet, but those are kind of our gut inclinations. And based on the free agent class and based on the draft class, you kind of say, this is the direction I think they would go in each area. But again, that can change dramatically if they sign someone in free agency or I guess they could also trade for somebody too. Like there's
I was going to say that is something to look out for, especially if there is I'm going to call it a distressed asset that's out there. That is kind of the Adam Peters special, right?
Yeah.
In San Francisco was, how do you get an elite offensive lineman? You trade for Trent Williams because he wants the hell out of Washington, and you get a Hall of Famer for a third round pick. So like that kind of stuff is, I think, worth watching. And
what about the Tyreek Hill thing that he kind of wants out of Miami? And again, like that's there.
I'm out specifically on Tyreek, but like that's the kind of thing.
That's kind of what I'm saying. Like
you look for, but Andrew Berry is saying that Myles Garrett's not going anywhere in Cleveland. If Myles Garrett wants out of Cleveland, Myles Garrett's going to get out of Cleveland. And like I would give up 29. I would give up my first round pick for Myles Garrett and wouldn't think twice about it.
Oh, so are you kidding? Yeah, they're not going to let him get out of there.
It's probably going to take that and next year's.
Yeah.
So like Myles Garrett's going to be hard to get, but I would give up a lot for Myles Garrett because he's Myles freaking Garrett. But like those are the kinds of players that if you can figure out how to get that quote unquote distressed asset in a trade, it's definitely worth it, and I think it's probably more worth it in considering you're picking at the end of the rounds.
Sure.
It's also worth remembering too, as we were talking about like the running back stuff in that kind of third round area. Washington does not have its own third rounder; it has Miami's, courtesy of the Jahan Dotson trade. So they'll pick earlier in that round, but they gave up their own third in the Marshawn trade.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and if you can find something like that, that'd be fantastic. It's just it would be fantastic. Like really, that would be kind of the big move that you're looking for in terms of getting a piece that can really help you right now. But again, that's hard to do because teams don't want to let those types of guys go.
No, for sure. And there are less and less. I was going to try to be nicer, but I can't think of a better word. There are less and less dumb front offices in the NFL. You got a lot of smart people in a lot of places. And there's certainly some GMs that still you're like, how do you operate? And you can rip them off, but that it is fewer and farther between as folks like Adam Peters, who are super duper smart, are infiltrating front offices around the NFL. All right, that is our show for today. That is our shows for this week. We'll be back next week. I think two things for next week, Logan, unless we come up with a better idea. But I think we should do a mailbag. and answer listener questions going into the offseason. So I've already gotten a couple that are good, but you can hit me on Instagram at Hoffman.sports. You can at Logan _Paulson82. You can also send me an email, hoffmanshow.com. Use the contact link, and you can drop your questions there. I guess technically you can leave it on Blue Sky too, but try to Instagram and email is my preferred mailbag dumping grounds, because then I don't have to go searching in a million places for the questions. So let us know what you want to know going into the offseason. And then I think a rookie report, looking back on the first Adam Peters draft class, how it performed. I wonder if Jaden Daniels is going to get a passing grade. You think once we review that in a little more depth that he
come on, don't spoil it. Yeah.
Hang out for that next week, boys and girls. Hold on to your seats. So we'll do that next week. In the meantime, Logan, enjoy the rest of your time in Mobile.
Thank you.
We'll review some of that on the show as well. Maybe we'll start before we get to the mailbag questions with a little Mobile recap on Monday or Tuesday, whenever we do the show next week. I don't know. What's a day anymore? That's Logan. I'm Craig. I don't know what day it is, but I do know this podcast is over. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.